10. Zachary Moellendick and Christa Lay. In early 2019, 23-year-old Zachary Moellendick and 24-year-old Christa Lay were caught stealing $51 worth of jewelry and baby toys from a Walmart in Fort Pierce, Florida. Store security called the police, and Officer Doug McNeil arrested the couple after reporting to the scene and observing them. Moellendick was using crutches at the time, so McNeil didn't handcuff him. Lay was originally handcuffed behind her back, but was recuffed in the front so she could smoke a cigarette. The pair were then put into the back of McNeil's squad car and taken to the St. Lucie County Jail. Police cam footage showed the couple kissing and cuddling during the drive. When they arrived at the jail's Sally Port, McNeil reportedly allowed Lay and Moellendick to smoke another cigarette. They were told to do so inside the patrol car, as the jail wouldn't allow them to smoke outside. And according to an internal affairs report, it was evident based on their body posture and arm movements that their behavior got even steamier after they smoked. A female officer nearby saw what was going on and raised the alarm to her superiors. McNeil said that he didn't think there was anything wrong with kissing and cuddling, and claimed that he didn't observe any signs of things going any further than that. But Lay and Moellendick admitted to investigators that they had, in fact, done things that are definitely not considered appropriate to do in the back seat of a police car. McNeil was subsequently suspended without pay for 20 days for violating multiple police policies. 9. William Parish Jr. and McKenzie Dobbs. After receiving several reports of drug overdoses in the city of Ocala in 2018, police carried out a search warrant at the mobile home of suspected drug dealers, William Parish Jr. and McKenzie Dobbs. During the raid, they discovered that the pair had turned their kitchen window into a drive-through for their customers, presumably to avoid the unwanted attention that might have come with people constantly entering and exiting their home. There were also signs for customers directing them to the window and specifying whether it was open or closed. Ocala Police Captain Stephen Cuddy told WFTV that the discovery came on the heels of several overdoses that occurred, not only in the general area, but at the specific location that they searched. At the trailer, officers found heroin laced with fentanyl. Authorities charged Parish with driving under the influence, keeping a dwelling used to sell drugs, possession of drugs with intent to sell, and resisting arrest without violence. Dobbs was charged with keeping a dwelling used to sell drugs, possession of drugs with intent to sell, possession of fentanyl, and possession of fentanyl with intent to sell. Shortly after the arrests, Parish's father told WFTV that the claims about the overdoses were lies, and that his son had recently been working to get his life together. 8. Mary and Oxus, Dorsainville. In early 2022, a man was allegedly lured to a Miami apartment by his friend, 52-year-old Mary Dorsainville, who'd contacted him and asked him for a ride to her home. According to a police report, Dorsainville invited him inside, but he said it was a bad idea because they were both married to other people. Dorsainville reportedly said her husband was out of town, so the man agreed to go inside. When he sat down on the couch, an accomplice to Mary named Oxus Dorsainville entered the room with a gun and bound the victim's hands and legs with chains. The Dorsainvilles allegedly forced the victim to rehearse and record a statement, admitting that he'd cheated on his wife with Mary. They were also accused of telling the man that if he went to the bathroom, they'd force him to eat it at gunpoint, and would shoot him if he refused. The pair offered the victim food the next day, but he declined because he worried that it would make him go to the bathroom. They also demanded a $50,000 ransom, which the man said he couldn't afford. He agreed to sign over the title to his vehicle in exchange for his release. On the third day of being held hostage, the victim was forced to shower at gunpoint. His captors then said they were finally going to free him. But first, they forced him to drink a bottle of rum mixed with bleach, so that he seemed drunk if the police pulled them over. It would give the captors the excuse that they were driving the victim home because he was intoxicated. The victim later told police that he pretended to be drunk and unconscious during the drive. But when he opened his eyes 20 minutes later, his kidnappers were gone. Bystanders then called the police for him, and he was taken to the hospital. Authorities charged the Dorsainvilles with kidnapping, armed robbery with a deadly weapon, attempted second-degree murder, and extortion. Just days later, they were accused of kidnapping another man. At the time, authorities said they suspected that there may be other victims, and encouraged anyone else who may have been abducted to come forward. 7. Mear Fuentes and Lilian Dominguez. Deputies in Monroe County received an unusual call one day in July of 2022 from a woman who'd received text messages from an unknown number demanding a $1,000 ransom in exchange for the return of her husband's service dog. The French bulldog, named Sailor, had gotten out of the couple's house in Marathon City earlier that day. After searching the neighborhood and posting on Facebook with no luck, Sailor's owners were left with no choice but to wait and hope for the pup's safe return. The woman agreed to hand over the $1,000 and planned to meet with the stranger demanding the ransom in Miami. But the dognapper made things complicated by changing the meeting location several times, and then saying that they wanted to keep Sailor. They finally agreed to meet at a mall though. But little did they know, the Miami-Dade police were aware of the situation and accompanied the woman to the location. Officers took 33-year-old Mear Fuentes and 26-year-old Lilian Dominguez into custody on suspicion of grand theft, dealing in stolen property, and use of a two-way communication device to facilitate a felony. Thankfully, Sailor was unharmed and was reunited with his family in the end. 6. Jose Padia Torres and Araceli Hernandez Santiago. It's unclear what led to a heated verbal disagreement between 44-year-old Jose Padia Torres and another man at a gas station in Winter Haven, Florida in 2022. Surveillance footage showed Torres going into the store while 44-year-old Araceli Hernandez Santiago waited in his car at a gas pump. In the video, Torres could be seen exiting the store and yelling at a man whose car was parked at the opposite side of the pump, prompting the man to walk over to see what Torres was saying. Torres responded by grabbing an aluminum bat out of his car and hitting the man with it. According to an arrest report, the victim managed to block the hit and took Torres to the ground. Santiago exited the car, grabbed the bat, and started swinging it at the man, whose girlfriend rushed over and stopped Santiago from hitting him. After returning to his car with Santiago, Torres allegedly threw the vehicle into reverse and rammed into the man. He tried to run the victim over 2 more times, but missed. So he drove into the man's car and left the scene. The victim and his girlfriend also drove away, and another altercation broke out when the parties ended up at the same intersection. Law enforcement was called to the scene, where they took Torres into custody on 2 counts of aggravated battery with a deadly weapon and criminal mischief. Santiago was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. But because this case is so recent, an outcome has yet to be decided. 5. Madison Megarl and Stephen Solstad. After going to the Key West home of 31-year-old Stephen Solstad to smoke some weed one day in 2021, a 50-year-old man found himself feeling more impaired than he expected. He fell asleep in his car, only to wake up to Solstad and his girlfriend, 22-year-old Madison Megarl, getting into the vehicle and forcing him into the passenger seat. According to the victim, Solstad punched him, threatened him with a razor, and held him captive for more than 30 hours. He gave them $150, but it apparently wasn't enough to satisfy the couple, who took him through a bank drive-thru and ordered him to withdraw money. But the victim didn't have his ID on him, so the bank wouldn't let him take any cash out. Solstad then allegedly drove to the victim's home, where he and Megarl stole clothes, electronics, and other items. They were accused of forcing the man to do drugs, so he remained incapacitated. After about a day, the suspects finally left the residence in the victim's car. Unsure of what drugs he'd been forced to take, the man sought medical help and went to the police. Solstad and Megarl were apprehended in Palm Beach County and were charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, grand theft, robbery, and grand theft of a motor vehicle. Unfortunately, there have been no recent updates on the case. 4. Stephen Lopez and Angela Viviana Velez Vasquez. While working as a taxi driver in Marathon City early one morning in 2023, 31-year-old Stephen Lopez met a 29-year-old woman who caught his eye. At the time, he was in an open relationship with his girlfriend, 20-year-old Angela Viviana Velez Vasquez. So he invited the woman back to their home for some fun with him and Velez Vasquez, and the woman obliged. Things got ugly during the impromptu romp, however, when the couple tried to dominate their guest. The woman responded with insults about certain body parts that people, especially men, generally don't take too kindly to. Lopez then allegedly grabbed her by the hair before Velez Vasquez threw her outside. According to a police report, the woman fell on the ground, and Velez Vasquez approached her and began punching her in the eye. The victim also accused Lopez of hitting her. As she got into her car to leave, a cinder block came crashing through her rear window. Lopez and Velez Vasquez reportedly claimed that they asked the guest to leave, but she refused, so they forced her out of the home. The couple claimed that Lopez threw the cinder block after the woman had hit one of them while reversing in her car, then exited her vehicle and swung at Velez Vasquez. To make a bizarre situation even weirder, the victim parked her car down the street and called the police, only to tell responding officers that Lopez and Velez Vasquez weren't the people who hit her, but that she wanted to press charges. The couple turned themselves in shortly thereafter, stating that they were, in fact, the ones who hit the woman. Authorities charged Lopez with throwing a deadly missile, while Velez Vasquez was charged with battery. At the moment, their cases appear to be ongoing. 3. Antonio Murdoch and Brianna Greco. After boarding an Atlanta-bound Delta flight at LaGuardia Airport in New York City in 2020, a Florida couple deployed the emergency escape chute and slid down it with their Great Dane. 31-year-old Antonio Murdoch and 23-year-old Brianna Greco were taken into custody on suspicion of mischief, criminal trespass, and reckless endangerment. And the couple's dog, Rain, was taken to an animal shelter in Brooklyn. After being arraigned at Queens Criminal Court, Murdoch told the press that he had no criminal intent and denied the charges. He said that he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and that confined spaces trigger his anxiety. As the plane headed toward the runway, Murdoch had a panic attack, but employees allegedly refused to let him and Greco get off the plane. He said he asked 3 or 4 times before opening the cabin door, and that he didn't realize it would activate the emergency slide. The incident happened during a verbal altercation between Murdoch and staff members, causing the more than 100 passengers on the plane to go into a panic. The rest of the passengers were then taken off the plane and accommodated with different flights. Murdoch and Greco were released pending the outcome of their cases, and were reunited with Rain. As they walked away from the animal shelter, Murdoch told the New York Post that they were in an emotional state and that they wanted to be left alone. 2. Ronald Mear and Linda Donahauer. While watching the Kelly Clarkson Show in Clearwater, Florida, the day before New Year's Eve in 2022, 61-year-old Linda Donahauer punched her partner, 55-year-old Ronald Mear, in the shoulder to quiet him down because he was annoying her. According to an arrest affidavit, Mear retaliated by climbing on top of Donahauer and punching her in the face. A responding officer observed a red mark and swelling on Donahauer's face and asked Mear about it. He said that he was just trying to get Donahauer to calm down and that he was unaware of the mark on her face. In his report, the officer noted that both parties seemed intoxicated and that it caused inconsistencies in their statements. The pair had reportedly been romantically involved for around 14 years. Neither Mear nor Donauhauer had any prior arrests or convictions before the incident. They were both taken into custody on suspicion of misdemeanor mutual domestic battery. After being kept in jail overnight, the couple were released pending the outcome of the case. The judge ordered them to stay away from each other, forcing them to cancel any plans they may have had to spend New Year's Eve together. 1. Martin Gonzalez Garcia and Ashi Ali's Roldan Ocasio. While squatting at a house in Kissimmee, Florida in 2023, Ashi Ali's Roldan Ocasio made a blank 911 call. Deputies tracked the location of the call and found her at the home with her boyfriend, Martin Gonzalez Garcia. Roldan Ocasio told the responding deputies that she dialed 911 to ask for help with moving the couple's belongings out of the house. She also said that she was hoping they'd give her and Gonzalez Garcia a ride to the airport so they could travel to New York for the weekend. The pair were likely unaware that law enforcement had been looking for them after they were allegedly seen stealing $138 worth of merchandise from a local Dollar General store. According to a Facebook post by the Polk County Sheriff's Office, the deputies gladly helped the couple with their belongings and gave them a ride, but not to the airport. Instead, they were taken to jail. Gonzalez Garcia reportedly confessed to stealing from Dollar General, saying that he needed money and planned to sell the stolen goods. He admitted that he knew what he did was wrong, but that he needed the money and that he and Roldan Ocasio broke into the house in Kissimmee because they needed to get out of the cold for the night. Authorities charged Gonzalez Garcia with burglary, theft, and burglary of a residence. Roldan Ocasio, on the other hand, was only charged with burglary of a residence.
Number 19, Stanton Pierce. In September 2016, the body of a missing 62-year-old man named Luis Martinez was found face down in a burn pile near a cemetery in Antioch, Texas. According to an affidavit, the discovery came after 56-year-old Lori Stone Perry called the Smith County Sheriff's Office and reported witnessing a murder about a week earlier. She claimed that she saw 37-year-old Rebecca Bon shoot Martinez multiple times. Perry admitted to breaking down the rifle, while Bond and a third suspect, 52-year-old Stanton Pierce, disposed of the victim's body. Police arrested Perry and Bond that night. They also captured Pierce after a vehicle and foot chase, followed by a 2-day manhunt. Bond allegedly admitted to shooting Martinez, although authorities have never revealed her motive. She was charged with murder, while Pierce and Perry faced charges for tampering with evidence. Stanton Pierce pleaded guilty to 2 counts of tampering and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. At his sentencing, the judge noticed that he was shaking his head back and forth, and when he was asked why he was doing it, Pierce said, "I never wanted this to happen. I'm just ashamed." He also mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," toward news cameras while being led out of the courtroom. Rebecca Bond took a plea deal and was sentenced to 50 years for murder, while Lori Perry received a 15-year sentence for tampering or fabricating physical evidence with intent to impair a human corpse. Number 18. People smugglers near the border. In late February 2023, a Zavala County deputy discovered a woman and child in the trunk of a car during a traffic stop. The driver was arrested on a smuggling charge, and the people in the trunk were turned over to Border Patrol. Zavala County is near the Mexican border, so it's nothing new for authorities to catch people transporting undocumented immigrants. Just 2 months after the car trunk incident, in April 2023, a truck pulling a horse trailer led deputies on an early morning chase after refusing to pull over for a traffic stop. When the truck finally pulled over, people began running from the horse trailer, and in the end, 25 undocumented migrants were detained. While helping people escape dire situations in hopes of pursuing a better life is an honorable cause, people smuggling is exploitative, dangerous, and sometimes deadly, especially for the migrants themselves. And for the smugglers, this means facing more serious criminal charges and consequences than someone who's caught with migrants who aren't suffering or dying. In September 2022, Zavala County deputies found two men sweating profusely and having difficulty breathing in the trunk of a car, and it was discovered after the fact that they were suffering from heat exhaustion. The driver and passengers of the vehicle were charged with felony smuggling of persons in the likelihood of causing serious bodily injury or death. These types of crimes also jeopardize the safety of both the public and law enforcement. In April 2023, a Texas Department of Public Safety trooper chased after a driver who refused to pull over for a traffic violation. The pursuit reached dangerously high speeds of up to 120 miles per hour before another officer attempted to lay a trap to deflate the suspect's tires. Footage showed the vehicle barreling straight toward the officer in an apparent attempt to run him over, but luckily he moved out of the way just in time to narrowly avoid being mowed down. In 2021, a famous TikToker lost his life during a police chase while transporting 3 undocumented migrants in Zavala County. After losing control of his car and running off the road, 19-year-old Gabriel Salazar overcorrected, causing his Chevy Camaro to veer off the other side of the road before hitting some trees, rolling over and bursting into flames. And sadly, everyone inside the vehicle lost their lives. Unfortunately, people smuggling is as popular as ever, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. But for now, authorities are doing what they can about it. Number 17. San Antonio's stolen shark. During the summer of 2018, a San Antonio aquarium visitor stole a gray horn shark that was 16 inches long, named Miss Helen. The male suspect was initially accompanied by another man and a woman as he wrapped the creature in a blanket, put her in a bucket of water, and then placed the bucket in a baby stroller. Staff members followed the thief into the parking lot and asked to search his vehicle, but he said that his child was sick and that he urgently needed to leave. When police received a call about a stolen shark, they initially thought they were being pranked, but they realized it was serious when they saw surveillance footage of Miss Helen's kidnapping. Investigators caught up with the suspects the next day after tracing the getaway vehicle's license plate, and after realizing they were caught, the trio confessed to the crime. When officers went to retrieve Helen from the home of the mastermind behind the crime, 38-year-old Anthony Shannon, they discovered that he was quite the marine enthusiast. His house was filled with numerous tanks containing exotic fish and other marine species, and he appeared very knowledgeable about the animals he kept. Until that point, authorities and aquarium staff members were positive that Helen hadn't survived her abduction, but much to everyone's relief, she was found in good health. Shannon initially tried to show law enforcement a fake receipt for the purchase of Miss Helen, but the police were quick to notice that the receipt had been doctored. Shannon eventually admitted to the theft and reportedly said that he stole Helen because he was trying to replace one of his sharks that had passed away. Thankfully, though, Helen was returned to the aquarium safe and sound. Shannon was charged with felony theft in the shark stealing case. And around the same time, he was accused of shoplifting $250 worth of pots and pans from a home goods store. He also had several theft convictions on his rap sheet, making it evident that he was no stranger to stealing. Number 16. William Anthony Hall. When 69-year-old William Anthony Hall noticed a vehicle with no handicapped tag parked in a handicapped spot outside a post office in Houston one evening in 2017, he felt compelled to take the law into his own hands. So he confronted the vehicle's owner, 67-year-old James Garza, a local attorney who was there to pick up mail from his P.O. box. Nobody knows exactly what happened in the moments leading up to Hall's decision to pull a gun and fire a single fatal bullet into Garza's chest. Hall claimed that Garza got physical with him and that he feared for his life. But that couldn't have been true, according to prosecutors, who argued that a bullet hole in Garza's mail proved that he was holding it rather than pushing Hall around when he got shot. People often think of Texas as a free-for-all when it comes to the use of guns, but this isn't the case, according to Assistant District Attorney Mary McFadden, who used the case as an opportunity to make it clear that a license to carry a gun isn't a license to kill. And she at least got her point across in court, because Hall was convicted of murder and received a 20-year prison sentence for the crime. Number 15. Stanley Sala. Most people visit strip clubs for a good time with no strings attached, but every now and then customers develop unhealthy feelings for dancers. It happened to a 22-year-old dancer from Fort Worth named Abigail Abby Saldana in 2021 when she began to fear that a regular customer at her workplace was stalking her. Then, just a few months later, she was killed. On the night of October 26th, Saldana was found murdered in her bullet-riddled car within view of her place of employment, Rick's Cabaret. Investigators quickly learned that she'd complained to her family, friends, and colleagues about an obsessed customer named Stan harassing her. Identified as 54-year-old Stanley Sala, the alleged stalker claimed in several Instagram posts that he and Saldana had been enjoying each other's company since July of 2021. He said that he saw a future with the young woman and that he paid her thousands of dollars over the course of their interactions, only to be lied to and taken advantage of. Sala also accused Saldana of being involved in a high-end prostitution ring. About 2 weeks before her murder, Saldana had found a tracking device on her car, and as the harassment continued, she told her friends and family that she was scared. According to investigators, a license plate reader picked up Salaga's truck passing through an intersection just seconds after Saldana's car, and just 17 minutes later, Saldana was killed. Additional surveillance footage allegedly shows Salaga's truck repeatedly driving past Saldana's apartment before the murder. Sala initially agreed to meet with the police at a certain time to discuss the case, but he never showed after he called and claimed that a family member had died, and when our SWAT team showed up at his door at 11:30 p.m., he refused to exit his home. He was eventually apprehended with a self-inflicted wound to his neck that required medical treatment. And based on the available records, Sala remains in custody without bond amid the ongoing case. Number 14, Charles Bryant. A 24-year-old college student named Jackie Vandergriff was found brutally murdered at a park in the town of Grapevine in September 2016. And surveillance footage from local bars showed a man named Charles Bryant striking up a conversation with Jackie just hours before her death. At the beginning of the investigation, detectives crossed paths with Bryant's recent ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Caitlin Mathis. She later told 48 Hours that within weeks of dating Bryant, she began to see red flags. Mathis described her ex's behavior as manipulative and narcissistic, and she said that when she ended the relationship just weeks before Vandergriff's death, Bryant refused to accept that it was over. He was arrested 3 times for showing up at the young woman's college, and she ultimately filed for a restraining order against him. On the day Vandergriff's body was found, Bryant contacted Mathis in violation of the restraining order. This was actually what landed him at the police station in the first place, giving authorities the opportunity to question him in connection with Vandergriff's murder. Bryant initially claimed to have no memory of the night Vandergriff died, and he insisted that he didn't even know who she was. But he eventually gave a detailed account of the crime, including details only the killer would know. During a search of the suspect's home, police recovered the large military-style knife that he had used to stab Vandergriff to death. They also found a receipt from 4:43 a.m., just 2 hours before the victim's body was found, and were able to connect it with surveillance footage of Bryant buying a shovel and cold medicine. A trash bin outside the suspect's home contained a satchel with Texas Woman's University printed on it. It was Vandergriff's college, and the bag matched one that she was seen carrying on her last night alive. Plastic zip ties with blonde hair in them were also found in the garbage can, and DNA testing confirmed that the hair belonged to the victim. Inside Bryant's vehicle, police found a cell phone battery that they believed belonged to Vandergriff, as well as a stun gun with her DNA on it. And between the suspect's confession and the physical evidence, it was enough to charge the suspect with murder. Investigators theorized that Bryant took his anger over his ex-girlfriend's rejection out on Vandergriff. His defense attorney argued that Vandergriff died of accidental asphyxiation during consensual intimacy, and that his client panicked and tried to dispose of her body because he was afraid of getting in trouble. But in the end, Bryant was found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Number 13, William George Davis. Staff members at a hospital in Tyler, Texas were baffled when patients began experiencing mysterious complications while recovering from heart surgery in 2017. It happened to at least 11 people over a 7-month period, leaving 6 of them dead. The patients were all in stable condition and were expected to recover when their conditions suddenly worsened. Doctors finally realized what was going on when they looked at CT scans that showed air in the victims' brains. The most likely explanation for how it happened was by someone deliberately injecting oxygen into the patient's venous systems or their arterial lines. Surveillance footage showed a nurse named Will Davis exiting rooms just minutes before the complications began, and in one incident, he stood at his station doing nothing while an alarm went off in a room of a patient he'd just treated. A search of his computer later revealed that he'd researched the effects of injecting air into a patient's line well in advance of his crimes. Davis was charged with capital murder in early 2018. However, his lawyer argued that his client was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and that the evidence didn't necessarily point to foul play. A small piece of the truth finally came out, though, in a jailhouse phone call Davis made to his ex-wife after he was convicted of the charges. His ex wanted the truth, and he said that he may have prolonged patients' illnesses so he'd continue getting enough overtime to pay the bills. Prosecutors rejected the explanation and stuck to their belief that Davis was a cold, calculating sociopath who killed for fun, which is probably the case. But it was the first time he admitted to any wrongdoing whatsoever. As of now, he's appealing his case from death row. Number 12. Baby born at Chick-fil-A. Fallon and Robert Griffin were on their way to San Antonio's University Hospital to have a baby in July of 2018 when the 38 weeks pregnant mother-to-be found herself with an urgent need to relieve her bladder. It simply couldn't wait, and the employees at a Chick-fil-A were kind enough to let Fallon use their restroom while they closed up the restaurant for the night. But what was meant to be a quick pit stop suddenly became a medical emergency. The couple's baby girl, Gracelyn, was ready to be born, and she wasn't going to wait long enough for the Griffins to get to the hospital. Robert coached his wife as she gave birth on the bathroom floor, while an employee named Brenda Enriquez called 911. Enriquez stayed on the line with the dispatcher to answer questions and take advice on how to handle the situation. But by the time paramedics arrived, Gracelyn had already entered the world. She was born with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck twice, but thanks to her dad, it was quickly removed and she was perfectly healthy. In a Facebook post that quickly caught the attention of news outlets across the country, Robert described how Chick-fil-A employees brought warm towels into the bathroom to keep the baby warm while they waited for an ambulance. And during an interview with local station KENS, the couple revealed that the restaurant had gifted baby Gracelyn with free food for life. Number 11. Billy Shermamere. Nobody knows how many elderly women Billy Shermamere has murdered, but as of 2023, he's been formally accused of killing 22 victims in northern Texas, and he's been convicted in 2 cases. It's also unclear when Shermamere killed his first victim, but he flew under the radar for years. The accused serial killer was caught in 2018 after a woman survived an attack. Someone had also recently filed a suspicious person complaint in the area in reference to Shermamere. Police soon zeroed in on him as the prime suspect in a series of murders that had recently occurred in the area and set up a sting at his apartment in Dallas. While performing surveillance on Shermamere shortly before his arrest, investigators saw him throwing a jewelry box into a dumpster, and it was labeled with the name Lutai Harris. And when officers went to the woman's home, they found her dead. At this point, the investigation into the possible extent of Shermamare's past crimes was just beginning. Detectives began reviewing past cases involving the deaths of elderly women and missing jewelry and compared them to Shermamare's phone records. Altogether, they connected him in 24 possible murders, and as a result, he was charged with 22 counts. According to police, in many cases, Shermamere went door to door posing as a maintenance worker. He also followed victims home from Walmart and forced his way into their houses. The deaths were repeatedly attributed to natural age-related causes, enabling him to continue killing undetected for far longer than most murderers get away with. Authorities claim that Shermamere sold the ill-gotten valuables he stole from his victims within hours of acquiring them. He peddled the items online and in pawn shops, and they were lost forever to the surviving family members who often valued the pieces more for sentimental reasons than their monetary value. In the end, Mear was convicted of murdering Lou Ty Harris and another victim named Mary Brooks. After securing 2 life convictions, which will hopefully ensure that Mear will remain behind bars even if he successfully appeals one of the cases, prosecutors dropped the 20 remaining murder counts. Victims' families were extremely upset by the decision, understandably so, and continue to advocate for legal changes that they believe will better protect elderly people living in Texas. Number 10. The Mummy Marauder. Employees at a First Convenience Bank branch in Harris County, Texas, experienced an especially hair-raising Friday the 13th in September 2019. Around 11:30 a.m. on what began as a normal day, a man wearing white gauze around his face and hand, along with a wig, sunglasses, and a baseball cap, entered the bank. He threatened a teller and demanded cash before fleeing the scene in a Mitsubishi Montero SUV. Authorities were thankful that nobody was hurt during the robbery, but they were determined to catch the man that had terrorized innocent people who were just going about their day. The FBI offered a $5,000 reward in exchange for information leading to the culprit's identification and arrest. Agency spokesman Connor Hagan told Fox News that they hoped to wrap the case up quickly. Unfortunately, though, there have been no updates on the case since it first hit the news, suggesting that the robber is still at large. Number 9. Monkeypox patient brings virus to U.S. In 2021, a middle-aged man who'd recently returned to Dallas from Nigeria was diagnosed with monkeypox, making him the first case in the U.S. since 2003. At a time when the world was still in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, the last thing anyone wanted to deal with was another outbreak of disease. So naturally, the news caused panic. By the time the patient went to the hospital, he'd been experiencing symptoms including fever, cough, and fatigue for 2 weeks. He also had a rash on his face, prompting staff to put him in an airborne isolation room, where extra precautions were taken to prevent the spread of pathogens. Luckily, monkeypox doesn't spread nearly as easily as COVID, and because masks were required in airports and on flights, the risk of spreading was low. But to be safe, the CDC monitored the situation and kept tabs on anyone who traveled on the same flight as the patient or had recently had contact with him. And in total, the agency kept an eye on 223 people for about a month and a half. Thankfully, though, no secondary cases were identified. According to CNN, monkeypox is related to smallpox, but it's less transmissible and less deadly. It spreads through infected bodily fluids and respiratory droplets. Initial symptoms include swollen lymph nodes, fever, headache, nausea, exhaustion, and muscle aches, with patients eventually developing the telltale rash that inspired the disease's name. But if treated, the illness only lasts for 2 to 4 weeks. Monkeypox reappeared in Texas several months after the July 2021 case, when another traveler tested positive for the virus. Then, throughout 2022, the number of cases increased. And in August of that same year, the first ever monkeypox-related death in the U.S. happened in Harris County. Number 8. Oscar Rosales. Just after midnight on January 23, 2022, 47-year-old Harris County Constable Charles Galloway activated the lights on his patrol vehicle in an attempt to pull over a Toyota Avalon. Once the car in question pulled over, Galloway radioed dispatch to inform them of the traffic stop. But he never got a chance to question the driver, who got out of his vehicle and approached the patrol car with a rifle in hand. The suspect shot at Galloway multiple times before getting into his vehicle and driving away, leaving Galloway to die at the scene. And it was later determined that he'd been killed by a single gunshot to the head. According to court documents, the car's plates came back to a 40-year-old woman named Reina Azucena Pereira Marquez. She told investigators that her common-law husband of 17 years, 50-year-old Oscar Rosales, had told her he was going hunting or shooting with friends before he took her car that night, leaving his own vehicle in the driveway. When police found the car, a man later identified as Reina Marquez's brother, Henri Mauricio Pereira Marquez, was seen wiping down the door handles of the vehicle. Rosales, however, was nowhere to be found. Authorities charged Reina Marquez and Henri Marquez with tampering with evidence while the manhunt for Rosales continued. A few days after the murder, Mexican authorities apprehended a fugitive across the border from Del Rio in Ciudad Acuña. He was extradited back to Texas, though, where he faces a capital murder charge. 2 additional suspects were also arrested for hindering apprehension. At the time of his arrest, Rosales was wanted in Texas on an aggravated assault charge from 1996, and he was also wanted in El Salvador for murder. He was in the United States illegally at the time of Galloway's murder, and based on his prior allegations of violence and the nature of his most recent alleged crime, District Attorney Kim Ogg said that the death penalty may be on the table. Number 7. Antoine Daniel Bon. 24-year-old Calogero Duenas and his wife Amber Aresti planned to spend New Year's Eve in 2021 celebrating their daughter's birthday at a Chuck E. Cheese in Humble, Texas. Amber was already inside the building when Calogero rushed in and yelled that he'd been shot. Then just seconds later, he collapsed and died from his injuries. Surveillance footage revealed that Calogero had gotten into an altercation with a man who drove the wrong way in the parking lot and almost hit him, and shortly after the two were seen exchanging words before a gunshot was heard. The suspect, 27-year-old Antoine Daniel Bon, remained at large for several days and was accused of committing several other crimes before his arrest. 2 days after Calogero's murder, he allegedly shot one man and shot at another outside a supermarket. And 3 days after that, he was arrested for assaulting one of his own family members. When shown surveillance footage of his alleged crimes, Bon denied that it was him in the video, but authorities believe otherwise, and he was booked on charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, assault of a family household member with a previous conviction, and murder. He's currently being held at the Harris County Jail while his cases proceed through the court system. Amber Aresti told local station KTRK that she could still hear her husband's screams in the back of her head and that his murder had left their 2 children heartbroken. She said she was relieved that Calogero's alleged killer was identified and locked up, and that she hoped Bon wasn't released while his case proceeded in court. Number 6. James Manning. A Dallas family was terrorized by sudden violence in 2020 when the father of the household shot his wife and kids in cold blood. According to an affidavit, 57-year-old James Manning, who's also listed as James Webb in some documents, began arguing with his wife, 35-year-old Victoria Bunton, at around 10 a.m. He had a headache that morning and said that the couple's teenage sons, Zyquan and Isaac, were being too loud. And while the details of how the situation escalated are unclear, Manning allegedly pulled a gun at some point and shot Victoria at least twice before turning the gun on his children. He waited about an hour before he contacted the police using an emergency medical alert device. And during the conversation, he told the dispatcher what he'd done. When police arrived at the scene, Manning allegedly told them that he got sick of his family members yelling and telling him that nothing was wrong with him, so he shot them, and as a result, he was charged with capital murder. Victoria's sister, Barbara McGee, told CBS News that the family never saw Manning's behavior as threatening, and as far as they knew, he'd never harmed Victoria or their sons in the past. But they did find him to be strange. He seemed distant and often stayed in the car instead of coming inside during visits, despite Barbara's attempts to welcome him into her home. In other words, it was as if he wanted nothing to do with his wife's family. And according to the most recent updates on the case, Manning's bond was set at $3 million. Number 5. Kevin Accorto. 33-year-old Janae Gagnier, known to her 3 million followers as Mercedes Moore, was both a dancer and a model. She eventually became popular enough on social media to make a living entirely from paid partnerships with sponsors. Mercedes was recognized pretty much everywhere she went throughout the Houston area, and she was often seen partying with celebrities. As an influencer, she never went long without checking her phone, which is why her family became worried when she went radio silent in August of 2021. And after waiting to hear from her with no luck, her father Mark Gagnier went to her apartment to check on her. But when Mercedes didn't answer the door, he kicked it in. What he saw next could perhaps be described as a parent's worst nightmare. He found Mercedes lying dead at the bottom of her staircase. Mark initially thought that she had had a terrible accident but when he entered his daughter's bedroom, he found a man clinging to life with a knife stuck in his neck. Later identified as 34-year-old Kevin Alexander Accorto, he soon succumbed to his injuries. Bizarre messages scrawled across Mercedes' wall with pink lipstick offered some of the only clues about the circumstances leading up to her murder. One of the ramblings stated, "Janae led me to think she cared about me but wore another man's ring," while another said, "I was used for money." An autopsy concluded that the victim died from strangulation and a traumatic concussion. But surprisingly, investigators found no evidence that her connection with Accorto extended beyond social media. Mark later told local station KTRK that he'd warned his daughter repeatedly about the dangers of social media. He also feared that a crazy person might become obsessed with his daughter and stalk or harm her, and unfortunately, his worst fears came true. Number 4. Thomas Hicks. In April 2021, emergency responders worked their way through a massive swarm of bees while entering the Breckenridge home of 70-year-old Thomas Hicks and his wife, Zonnie. Hicks had been aggressively attacked and went into cardiac arrest. Zonnie later told Big Country homepage that Thomas was about to mow the lawn while she went grocery shopping, and before leaving the house, she reminded her husband not to go into a certain corner of the yard where they'd observed a lot of bee activity. But when she returned home, she found Thomas jumping and screaming amid a swarm of bees. Apparently, he was so covered in the tiny insects that Zonnie couldn't see his head or back. As she watched her husband collapse to the ground, Zonnie frantically dialed 911. Paramedics worked on Thomas for an hour before concluding that there was nothing they could do to save him, and sadly he was pronounced dead at the scene. Meanwhile, a firefighter removed his own protective gear and put it on Zonnie, who survived the attack and was rushed to the hospital. Local beekeeper Joey Venekamp removed the hive from a hollowed-out tree behind the family's shed. He estimated that it was about 2 years old and therefore a well-established hive. At the time, there was an ongoing battle for the queen of the hive, making the bees highly aggressive and therefore more prone to attack. Venekamp told Big Country homepage that when a bee stings someone, it emits a pheromone warning other bees of the perceived threat. He also said that the best thing to do in a situation like that is take cover. Number 3. Kwame Travion Boyd. 25-year-old Kavana Smith was 4.5 months pregnant when she was shot dead in the middle of a Houston street during the early morning hours in October of 2021. A witness told police that he saw a couple arguing as he walked to his vehicle to leave for work. He then described watching a man shoot Kavana before fleeing the scene in a white pickup truck. Another witness claimed that as he drove by the arguing couple shortly before the shooting, Kavana hit the back of his vehicle to get his attention and asked him to call the cops. And when the driver noticed the suspect holding a gun, he decided not to stop. There was also a woman living nearby who was already on the line with 911 when she watched the shooting happen. Authorities quickly zeroed in on 25-year-old Kwame Travion Boyd as their prime suspect. According to Kavana's family members, she'd just confirmed her pregnancy the day before the murder. Boyd, who already had 4 children and was unemployed, was allegedly upset by the news because he didn't want any more kids. And shortly before she was killed, Kavana texted her location to a friend and said she was at Boyd's apartment trying to get some money he owed her. She said she was sharing her location in case anything happened to her. Then, a few minutes later, Kavana messaged the same friend saying that she'd been abducted. She identified Boyd as her kidnapper and said he didn't want to give her the money she'd come for. The friend told her that she'd come get her, but that's when Kavana stopped responding, and by then it was too late. While searching Boyd's home, police found a card announcing her pregnancy and containing an ultrasound image. She was clearly excited about it, making the situation even more tragic. In the end, authorities charged Boyd with capital murder, but the killer's case appears to be ongoing. Number 2. Alexander Nathan Barter. In 2018, a 21-year-old Joaquin, Texas man named Alexander Nathan Barter posted an ad on the dark web in search of a willing victim to fulfill his desire to experience cannibalism and necrophilia. He also wrote that he wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. The disturbing post caught the attention of a federal undercover officer who responded pretending to be a single father from Florida. And over a 10-day period, the parties exchanged messages regarding Barter's desire to assault, kill, and eat the agent's teenager. Barter showed up at the designated meeting spot with a knife, trash bag, cell phone, and tablet, and by all appearances he planned to follow through with his horrific fantasy. Thankfully though, instead of meeting with an unsuspecting victim, he was nabbed by law enforcement. He was hit with a slew of federal charges, but ended up taking a plea deal and admitting to 2 child exploitation charges in exchange for 2 20-year sentences. The defense urged the judge to impose the sentences concurrently, while the prosecution called for the sentences to run consecutively. Much to the relief of anyone who believed Barter needed to be locked up for as long as possible, the judge imposed the sentences consecutively, which amounts to a total of 40 years behind bars, followed by lifetime supervision. Special Agent in charge Mark Dawson described the case as one of the most morally depraved and appalling criminal conspiracies he'd seen in 23 years of working in law enforcement. And following Barter's sentencing, U.S. Attorney Stephen J. Cox cited the case as a chilling reminder of how online talk is not always just talk. Number 1. Terry Turner. Adil Degui was likely lost when he pulled into the driveway of a stranger's home in Martindale, Texas, late at night in early 2022. But the man who lived at the residence, 65-year-old Terry Turner, apparently didn't think about this when he marched outside with his gun. According to police, Adil was frantically trying to back out of the driveway when Terry approached the car and shot him through the driver's side window, ultimately killing the man. Terry then went back into his house and dialed 911, telling the dispatcher that he'd just killed a guy who tried to shoot him first. Responding officers didn't find the gun in Adil's car, and they weren't convinced that the shooting was a true case of self-defense. So authorities charged Terry with murder, giving Adil's family hope that justice would be served. But now they're not so sure. More than 2 years later, the case still hasn't gone to trial, and Terry remains free on bond, leaving the victim's loved ones feeling increasingly convinced that he'll never be held accountable for Adil's death. The victim's family told local station KXAN that they've lost faith in the American justice system. Caldwell County District Attorney Fred Weber said that it's normal for murder cases to take 2 to 3 years to process through the court system. He further explained that this is often the case even in the absence of a COVID-related backlog of cases. Weber told KXAN that his office had been keeping Adil's family up to date on the progress of the case and that he hoped to get it in front of a jury as soon as possible. But as things currently stand, the case is slated to go to trial sometime in the fall of 2023.
Dre Sylvester. After spending some time at the Cook County Jail for violating bail on a previous gun charge in 2021, 31-year-old aspiring rapper Dre Sylvester was fitted with an ankle monitoring bracelet and sent on his way. As he exited the facility around 9 o'clock at night, 2 cars pulled up. A pair of gunmen exited the vehicle and sprayed him with an onslaught of bullets. In what can only be described as a cold and calculated case of overkill, Sylvester was shot 64 times, ensuring that there was no chance he would survive. A 60-year-old woman who had just posted Sylvester's bail was shot, but survived, along with a jail employee who was grazed by a bullet. After accomplishing what they came to do, the shooters fled the scene. Known by the stage name KTS Dre, Sylvester was allegedly a member of the gangster Disciple street gang. Police released few details about the deadly shooting, including how the suspects might have known he was about to be freed from jail or what their motive may have been. The case has remained largely absent from the news since it first broke, suggesting that the investigation is still under tight wraps or has perhaps come to a standstill. In the absence of any reports that the suspects have been captured, it's probably safe to assume they're still at large. 13. Genesis Escobar. In what can only be described as a senseless and preventable tragedy, 21-year-old mother-to-be Genesis Escobar put her life on the line in a bid for some quick cash one day in early 2023. It's unclear whether she was struggling to make ends meet or purely out for financial gain, but her reasons were enough to motivate her to get into someone's car and demand their money when she was 7 months pregnant. Shortly after Escobar entered the vehicle in Chicago's Belmont-Gragan neighborhood, gunfire erupted in and around the vehicle. According to witnesses, Escobar attempted to carry out the crime with a handful of accomplices, including her boyfriend, and both parties exchanged bullets, but it's unclear whether she herself was armed. The shooters dumped the dying young woman out of the car into an intersection with multiple gunshot wounds, covered her with cash, and sped off. Escobar's boyfriend allegedly grabbed a handful of the money and ran away, leaving his own girlfriend for dead. Family friend Iris Alvarez, who lives nearby, told News 4 that Escobar texted her daughter shortly before the botched robbery pleading for help. But Iris's daughter was sleeping at the time and didn't immediately respond to the messages. A few minutes later, residents found Escobar in the street, struggling to breathe. Good Samaritans rushed her to the hospital, but neither Escobar nor her unborn child survived. To Alvarez, it didn't necessarily matter what role Escobar played in the crime that was being committed. In her view, only a heartless individual could shoot another human in cold blood. The investigation is ongoing, and the suspect remains at large. 12. Diamond Bradley. A pair of young sisters named Tionda and Diamond Bradley vanished into thin air from Chicago's South Side in 2001. The girl's mother came home from work to find a note that was allegedly written by Tionda, stating that the pair had gone to the playground. They never came home, and relatives have long believed that the spelling and grammar in the note was too advanced for a girl Tionda's age, leading them to suspect that someone else wrote it. Tionda and Diamond's disappearance sparked one of Chicago's largest ever searches, yet no trace of the girls ever turned up, and more than 20 years went by without any major breaks in the case. But that may soon change. In a TikTok video that went viral in May of 2023, a woman who believes she may be Diamond Bradley could be seen hanging out with her friend at night near a parked Harris County, Texas law enforcement vehicle. At the urging of her friend, the woman revealed a scar that appears to match the description of a scar that Diamond had when she went missing. She also appears to be around the same age as Diamond, who would be in her mid-20s if she's still alive. It's extremely rare for a missing person to turn up after several years, let alone decades. But the woman in the video appears to truly believe that she might be Diamond. Shortly after the video appeared online, she got in touch with Diamond's great-aunt, Shalia Bradley Smith, to discuss the potential next steps in determining whether she's the missing girl. She then went to an FBI office and provided her fingerprints and DNA for a test, which will soon confirm or disprove her suspicions. The FBI agreed to expedite the testing, and the results could come at any time. While the potential to solve the mystery has brought up renewed hope to the case, it's also dredged up years-old feelings of dread and despair among Diamond's loved ones, according to Bradley Smith. Speaking to NBC Chicago, the great-aunt said that the resurfacing trauma has been hard to process. She described the ordeal of losing the sisters as a living nightmare and said that this wouldn't be the first time loved ones got their hopes up. And they've been let down in the past, making them especially cautious this time around. But as Bradley Smith conceded, the family isn't going to ignore a possible lead, even if it hurts to face the potential of being disappointed again. All they can do now is to wait for the test results to come back. 11. The Great Chicago Flood. Like any city, Chicago floods from time to time, and sometimes it gets pretty messy. But when people noticed fish swimming around in the flooded basements of homes and businesses near the Chicago River in 1992, they knew they were dealing with an extremely unusual and particularly disastrous situation. Unlike the types of floods the city was used to dealing with, the sudden influx of water wasn't caused by a broken main or a conventional case of excessive rain. In fact, it was a bright, sunny day. Nothing even seemed to be wrong at ground level. Yet hundreds of millions of gallons of river water were pouring into Chicago's underground spaces, and by the time the 911 call started rolling in, authorities were essentially powerless to stop it. For the first known time in history, the Loop District was officially closed. Hundreds of thousands of people were evacuated, and they were very confused since there were no signs of a flood or any type of disaster above ground. Electricity and utilities were shut off in the immediate area, causing disruptions in subway service. The area remained shut down for 2 days while experts and crew worked to fix the problem. The source of the flooding was traced to a crack in an old freight tunnel caused by a construction crew who took shortcuts in their work. It took a week to plug up the hole that the water was rushing in through, followed by several days of pumping to get the water out of all the basements. Fixing the mess came at a jaw-dropping price tag of around $2 billion. To prevent a similar incident from ever happening again, the city implemented multiple changes to its underground management policies. Chicago's old freight tunnels fell out of use before the 1960s, long before the flood, and city officials saw no harm in paying no attention to them. The most expensive takeaway, highlighted by the expensive disaster, is the importance of maintaining the system on some level, even though it's abandoned, and how conveniently ignoring deserted infrastructure can lead to unintended chaos. 10. Brown's Chicken Massacre. One of the most baffling and terrifying Chicagoland murders of all time happened at a Brown's Chicken restaurant in the northwestern suburb of Palatine in January 1993. Just minutes before closing time, 2 men entered the business and opened fire on 7 staff members, including owners Richard and Lynn Ellenfeld and employees Guadalupe Maldonado, Michael Castro, Rico Solis, Thomas Menez, and Marcus Nelson. 6 of the 7 victims were shot dead, while the 7th victim was slashed across the throat. The murders were discovered more than 5 hours later after several workers failed to return home, prompting their families to call the police. Responding officers found the victims' bodies stacked atop one another in the restaurant's walk-in freezer. It was one of the most horrifying crimes to ever occur in the area, and the public became increasingly alarmed as authorities failed to make any arrests in connection with the case. Retired Palatine police officer Brian Opitz later told ABC 7 Chicago that at least 100 members of various law enforcement agencies were working the murders at the height of the investigation, including state police, FBI agents, Chicago police, and others. Despite the immense resources that were poured into the case, few meaningful leads came until 6 years later, when a piece of chicken with a single bite taken out of it yielded an unidentified DNA sample. 3 years after that, in 2002, a woman named Ann Lockett implicated her ex-boyfriend, James Degorski, and his associate, Juan Luna, in the brutal massacre. Using technology that didn't even exist at the time of the murders, law enforcement matched the DNA sample from the partially eaten chicken to Juan Luna. The suspect, who was a former employee of the restaurant, confessed to the crime during questioning, but argued in court that his confession was coerced. Prosecutors argued that the suspects were motivated mainly by a desire to kill in cold blood. Luna had left his job at the restaurant months earlier on good terms, and while the men did rob the restaurant, it seemed unrealistic to think that they killed 7 people purely for the sake of carrying out a robbery. The jury convicted both Luna and Degorski each on 7 counts of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without parole. 9. Mary Agnes Maroney. When Catherine Maroney and her husband Michael fell on hard times at the onset of the Great Depression, she wrote to a welfare agency asking for help. Like many Americans at the time, the couple was struggling to support their 2 daughters on meager wages, and they had another baby on the way. The family's address wasn't supposed to be published along with the letter requesting donations. But it somehow got leaked, and a woman claiming to be a social worker named Julia Otis soon showed up at the Maroney's apartment above a Chicago grocery store. She came with gifts for the kids, but Catherine felt uncomfortable when she overheard Otis asking her oldest daughter, Mary Agnes, if she wanted to go to California. Catherine asked Otis to leave, but she returned the next day with more presents. Caught between a rock and a hard place, the young mother gave Otis permission to take Mary Agnes shopping for some new clothes, despite her lingering suspicions from the previous day. Sure enough, the woman kidnapped the little girl. The next day, Catherine received a letter from Otis stating that she had taken Mary Agnes to California and would return her in a month. But that never happened, and the months soon turned to years, and the years became decades. The family failed to find Mary Agnes before her parents passed away, causing a lifetime of anguish that was passed down through generations as they struggled to solve the mystery. Journalists and law enforcement also investigated the case, but only 2 promising leads turned up over the years. And until DNA technology came around, there was no way to be sure if either of the women were Mary Agnes. In 1952, the Chicago Daily News claimed that a young woman named Mary McClelland had been identified as Mary Agnes, who had been missing for 32 years by that point. Catherine could tell that McClelland wasn't her daughter, and DNA confirmed her suspicion in 2008. Another woman named Martha Thompson was ruled out based on DNA in 2018. Answers finally came in 2023 after Cook County Sheriff's Detective Jose Rodriguez inherited the case as part of a renewed missing persons initiative. Authorities and Mary Agnes's surviving relatives now believe with confidence that the girl was adopted to new parents in Florida and raised as Jeanette Burchard. She died in 2003 at the age of 75, and her loved ones were not willing to exhume her body to confirm the suspicion 100%. But DNA tests on living descendants revealed a family link between Burchard's daughter, Terry Arnold, and Mary Agnes's nephew, Don Maroney. Based on the results, the 2 parties appear to be cousins, making it extremely likely that Burchard was Mary Agnes. As a child, Burchard was told that she'd spend the first 6 years of her life in Chicago before relocating to Florida. She was raised by parents who she believed were her mother and stepfather. At one point, Burchard's stepfather hinted that the woman who raised her might not be her biological mother. She asked around, but nobody in her life knew it to be true, so the news nevertheless came as a major shock to her surviving family members. Meanwhile, Mary Agnes's relatives were relieved to learn that she was loved and treated well growing up. Burchard worked as a nurse for 50 years and raised 3 children. By all accounts, she had a happy, normal life and knew nothing of her true identity. Although Mary Agnes has been identified, questions continue to surround the case, including how she ended up in the custody of the couple who raised her and whether they were aware that she was kidnapped, or perhaps even played a direct role in her abduction. 8. O'Hare Station Crash. It's not entirely unheard of for trains to derail along Chicago's elevated system, which consists of 8 lines and is the second busiest rapid transit system in the United States. According to an NBC5 Chicago report from 2019, 27 derailments had occurred over the previous 10 years. Most incidents are minor, but every now and then passengers are injured or worse. One of the worst accidents in recent years came in 2014, when a train operator fell asleep at the controls and overshot the track at the O'Hare Airport L station. The 8-car train was going faster than the usual few miles per hour the trains typically pull into stations at, but it wasn't going insanely fast. It nevertheless crashed hard enough for the front car to barrel partially up an escalator before coming to a full stop. Between the station and the train, damages totaled nearly $11.2 million, and the Chicago Transit Authority paid out millions in lawsuit damages. 34 people were injured in the collision. Luckily, there were no deaths. The train's driver, Brittany Tyshecker Haywood, told investigators that she'd been working a lot of overtime and admitted to dozing off on the job. Just a month earlier, she'd overshot the tracks at another station, albeit without anywhere near the level of damage that occurred at O'Hare. While she'd previously denied falling asleep during the first incident, it became pretty clear that this was probably the case. A National Transportation Safety Board investigation recommended that the CTA and other transit agencies across the US make it a priority to better address the issue of driver fatigue. 7. Zachary Stoner. Zachary Stoner was a pioneer in the niche journalism genre of gangland reporting, who reported on elements of everyday life in Chicago that the mainstream media usually avoids or only covers from a safe distance. In addition to interviewing known gangsters, he showcased local musicians and other facets of life in his community that often go ignored by the press. His rapport with the community also enabled him to feature interviewees that the mainstream media didn't have access to. Stoner gained a sizable national following on his YouTube channel, Zach TV, where he described his content as Hood CNN. But his blossoming career was tragically cut short in 2018 when he was shot in the head in a drive-by shooting. He'd just left a nightclub during the pre-dawn hours and was driving in his Jeep when a car filled with several suspects pulled up alongside him. At least one of the suspects opened fire, striking Stoner in the head and neck. He lost control of his vehicle and crashed into a light pole and died a few hours later at the hospital. The shooting came as a surprise to many. While Stoner undoubtedly inserted himself into dangerous situations as part of his work, he was known as a peacemaker who generally stayed on good terms with most people. But his content was also controversial in many ways. He often discussed conspiracy theories and allegedly angered some people by interviewing certain rappers. Stoner had even received threats leading up to his murder, showing that there's no such thing as a journalist being on good terms with everyone they cross paths with. As years went by without any announced arrests, people increasingly wondered what was going on with the case or if Stoner's killers would ever face justice. In 2023, the Associated Press revealed the police had arrested 5 suspects in 2018 and 2019, but prosecutors declined to pursue charges for multiple reasons. Citing a controversial concept that's sometimes used in Chicago known as mutual combat, authorities reportedly concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to blame one party or the other for inciting the violence. Under its legal definition, mutual combat occurs when a fight or struggle which both parties enter willingly or where two persons, upon a sudden quarrel and in hot blood, mutually fight upon equal terms and where death results from the combat. Simply put, the law apparently didn't see it as their beef to get involved in. They also noted that the case wasn't viable to stand up in court due to inconsistent witnesses and insufficient evidence. The suspects were released and Stoner's killers remain at large. In recent years, the mutual combat concept has come increasingly under fire as a growing number of Chicago shootings go unprosecuted. Civilians are becoming increasingly concerned as suspects continue to be turned loose after being taken into custody for extremely violent gun activity. 6. Lakeisha Holmes. 33-year-old mother of 4 Lakeisha Holmes was tragically gunned down in broad daylight one morning in 2017, less than 2 weeks after being released from prison. According to authorities, she was walking down the street when a man pulled up in a car, exited the vehicle and began chasing her on foot. The suspect shot Holmes 12 times before getting back into his car and speeding away. It was initially believed that Holmes knew her killer and that she was victimized during a domestic dispute. This was later found to be untrue. Investigators uncovered surveillance footage of the murder, but it wasn't clear enough to identify the shooter. As the 1-year anniversary of the crime approached, Lakeisha's mother spoke out to set the record straight. During an interview with Block Club Chicago, Belinda Johnson said that she believes her daughter was lured to her death by a man she barely knew. In fact, she claimed that everyone in Lakeisha's social circle knows who killed the young woman. Johnson said that she doesn't know the man personally, and she declined to provide his name to reporters. The grieving mother conceded that her daughter had spent time in and out of jail for participating in an identity theft ring, but she said she was unsure what the motive for Lakeisha's murder was. Johnson admitted that Lakeisha learned how to steal identities by watching her do it. Neither of the women ever meant to let it take over their lives. According to Johnson, her intention was always to come up with a baseline amount of savings with her ill-gotten funds, enough to survive while she transitioned to making a legitimate living. But the money came easy, and it was a lot more than many jobs pay, and the temptation was ever present. Johnson finally got away from crime following a harsh prison stint, but her daughter was apparently still caught up in it. Shortly before she was killed, Lakeisha told her mum that she wanted to get her life on track and leave her current lifestyle behind. Sadly, she never got the chance she deserved to turn things around. The police confirmed to Block Club Chicago that they're not investigating the case as a domestic dispute, but have released few other details. The killer remains at large, and Lakeisha's murder remains shrouded in mystery. 5. The Tylenol Murders. Over a week-long period starting in late September 1982, 7 people in and around Chicago died from taking poison Tylenol that had somehow made its way to store shelves. Heavily laced with potassium cyanide, the capsules were undoubtedly tampered with by someone who fully intended to kill people. One lucky survivor, Linda Morgan, picked up a bottle of the painkiller to ease a sore leg. For reasons that she still can't fully explain, the 35-year-old got a bad feeling about the pills. She followed her gut and decided not to take any, and opted for a different over-the-counter painkiller. Linda would soon learn that her decision was life-saving. After learning of the deaths, Johnson & Johnson immediately issued a recall of over 31 million bottles of Tylenol, while adamantly urging the public not to take the medication. The company and police both launched investigations and discovered that the tainted pills were manufactured in 2 separate states, indicating that they were tampered with after reaching store shelves. It's believed that the culprits stealthily removed the boxes from shelves, tainted their contents, and put them back on the shelves without being noticed. Acting on a tip from a bar owner, authorities investigated a 48-year-old grocery store worker named Roger Arnold. According to the tipster, Arnold was a regular at his bar and had recently discussed killing people with a white powder. His behavior had also become noticeably erratic following the failure of his marriage. During a search of Arnold's home, police found instructions for making potassium cyanide. They held him several times for questioning, but never had enough evidence to arrest him. Arnold landed himself in prison on a separate case in 1983, when he went after the bar owner who reported him to law enforcement and accidentally shot someone else. He expressed deep remorse for the shooting from behind bars and died in 2008. Investigators exhumed Arnold's remains 2 years later to obtain a DNA sample, which ultimately proved that he was not a match to the Tylenol suspect. At one point, a New York man named James William Lewis tried to take responsibility for the poisonings. He mailed a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding a $1 million payment to make the poisoning stop, but authorities ultimately determined that he was trying to get money. Lewis served 13 years in prison for extortion. In 1983, the FBI purposely leaked the location of one of the victims' grave sites and put the site under 24-hour surveillance in hopes that the killer would visit the burial. But months passed without any useful leads, resulting in yet another dead end in the investigation. Besides failing to narrow their sights on the sick mastermind of the crime, both law enforcement and the public at large have struggled to understand what the culprit's motive could possibly be. No arrests were ever made in connection with the more than 40-year-old case, but authorities are still intent on solving it. In 2023, they announced plans to run new testing on evidence in hopes of identifying a suspect through DNA technology. To prevent a similar incident from happening, Johnson & Johnson developed caplets and packaging that are much more difficult to tamper with. In 1983, Congress passed the Tylenol Bill, which makes it a federal crime to tamper with over-the-counter medication. 4. The Chicago heat wave. In what some have called the worst disaster ever to strike Chicago, and one of the deadliest climate disasters in US history, the city was choked by a brutal 5-day heat wave in 1995. According to the Scientific American, temperatures peaked at 115 degrees Fahrenheit, but actually felt more like they were in the 120 range. The heat wave was caused by a high-pressure system that came with low winds, high humidity, and consistent daytime temperatures in the 90s or higher. Even at night, Chicago's residents were unable to catch a break from the scorching temps, which remained well into the 80s. The conditions were extremely unusual for a Midwestern summer and downright dangerous for a dense urban environment where the thick, hot summer air tends to linger in place. To say that the city was unprepared for what came next would be an understatement. A lot of people either didn't have air conditioning or couldn't afford to run theirs, giving them no choice but to languish in the stifling heat. To make matters worse, many residents without air conditioning also kept their windows closed due to fears of crime. As a result, people began to drop like flies, and bodies began pouring into morgues in droves. The first 4 deceased victims were found on the second day of the heatwave. What started as a trickle soon turned into a deluge. By the time the heatwave was over, it had claimed 735 lives. Sadly, most of the victims were elderly and/or poor. Back then, however, a heatwave was hardly considered a climate disaster. Even as the death toll began to rise, then Mayor Richard M. Daley wrote it off as typical summer heat. He told civilians not to blow it out of proportion and accused the media of overhyping the event. In an arguably more cringeworthy statement, Chicago's Human Services Commissioner at the time, Daniel Alvarez, described the mounting fatalities as the result of people neglecting themselves. But the effects of the heatwave eventually became undeniable, and Alvarez eventually apologized for his words. He vowed that the city's leadership would learn from their mistakes to prevent history from repeating itself. But it took some time for the city to make good on that promise, and it wasn't anywhere near as prepared as it should have been when another historic heatwave struck again 4 years later, in 1999. During the 3-day period, Chicago set a new all-time humidity record, with the dew point peaking at 83 degrees. Today, the city's much better prepared for extreme summer heat, which is only expected to worsen in the coming years due to climate change. As part of the Chicago Climate Action Plan, emergency management officials have an emergency protocol in place that clearly specifies when and how to take action in the event of potentially life-threatening conditions. In addition to conducting wellness checks on the elderly and other vulnerable civilians, the plan calls for the availability of cooling centers and buses. It may not be enough for the prolonged periods of extreme heat that seem to only be getting longer each year, but authorities remain dedicated to keeping the response requirements up to date. 3. The murder of Charles Merriam. Amoco oil executive Charles Merriam was at his suburban Chicago home one night in 1987 when someone knocked on his front door. The 52-year-old answered the door in his pajamas and came face to face with 2 men dressed as Chicago cops, who shot him twice in the chest and once in the head. After executing Merriam in cold blood, the killers left the scene. They remain at large to this day. In the days leading up to the shooting, Merriam had become increasingly concerned about his safety. He was implementing some major changes at his local gas stations, which were being converted from full-service gas and repair shops to self-serve convenience stores. The revamped business model put Merriam at odds with Frank Melito, who was Chicago's biggest gas dealer at the time. Fearing for his safety, Merriam had requested protection while visiting his businesses. A year before he was killed, Merriam was approached by federal prosecutors who wanted his help nailing Melito in a suspected tax and mail fraud case. Naturally, this would have only added to any existing reasons Melito may have had for wanting him out of the picture. Melito had strong political and local law enforcement connections, along with ties to the mob, and his name was the first thing that came to a lot of people's minds in trying to solve Merriam's murder. But the case quickly went cold and landed on the back burner before being all but forgotten about. As the 35th anniversary of the crime rolled around in 2022, Merriam's son Ken told ABC7, Chicago's I-Team, that his father's murder had been covered up for decades. He accused local authorities of shirking the investigation because the findings might embarrass the police department. After all, the killers were connected enough with the agency to get their hands on authentic uniforms. Ken also claimed that investigators told him that they were pretty sure who committed the murder, but not to expect any charges to be filed. He even said that police told him hitmen were paid $6,000 each to carry out the execution. Sadly, the case appears no closer to resolution now than it did decades ago. Various law enforcement agencies declined to speak with the I-Team, including the FBI and the Cook County Sheriff's Office, but both said they were willing to pursue any new leads that came in. 2. The loop crash of 1977. The worst accident in the history of Chicago's elevated transit system happened in early 1977, when 2 trains collided during a Friday evening rush hour in the city's busy Loop District. At the time, trains often traveled in both directions along shared tracks. Long story short, a train driver overrode stop signals, which operators were able to do at the time, and rammed into the back of another train along a curve. Those who were on the rear train later said that the impact didn't feel major, probably because it was only going about 10 miles per hour at the time of the crash. But the driver continued to apply power, causing the train to keep trying to move forward, even though it was pinned against the vehicle in front of it. As a result, the rear train jackknifed, causing the first 3 cars to fall off the track. The first car landed on a track support structure, while the second and third plunged straight to the ground below. A fourth car dangled precariously off the track's edge. 11 people were killed and 268 were injured. The collision was ultimately blamed on human error. More specifically, the train's operator Stefan Martin reportedly had a poor safety record. While it's unclear exactly what caused him to carry out the maneuvers that led to the accident, distraction appeared to be the main problem. In a moment of panic after the initial collision, Martin pushed forward on the controller, causing the ensuing derailment. Following the crash, the CTA banned train operators from overriding signals without obtaining permission first. In the years since, trains that once shared tracks along the loop have been separated to further reduce the risk of another deadly accident. 1. Tinley Park Lane Bryant murders. 4 customers were shopping at a Lane Bryant store in Chicago's Tinley Park suburb one morning in 2008 when a man entered the store and announced that he was committing a robbery. He forced the customers and 2 employees on duty into a back room at gunpoint and tied them up before shooting them execution style. The shoppers and one of the workers died. With help from the surviving victim, police created a composite sketch of the suspect who fled the scene after the massacre. They also released a voice clip of the killer, who could be heard ordering the victims around during a 911 call placed by the store's manager. Thousands of tips poured in, but police appear no closer to solving the case today than they were more than 15 years ago. And while the suspect did clean out a cash drawer before fleeing, investigators were never able to establish a clear motive for the crime. After pouring $2.6 million worth of resources into the case and barely getting anywhere with it, they're relying on the public to continue coming forward with information that will lead them in the right direction. Former U.S. Marshal Ed Farrell, who was previously assigned to the case, told ABC 7 Chicago's I-Team in 2023 that he believes the necessary evidence and information for solving the crime is available. But detectives not only have to narrow it down, like finding a needle in a haystack, they need to reverse engineer what Farrell describes as the electronic footprint left behind by those involved in the crime. Based on surveillance footage, he doesn't believe the shooter acted alone. Shortly before the massacre, security footage captured 2 vehicles pulling up to the scene together and then leaving at the same time. Farrell and others are hoping the right tip comes along and paves the way for putting all the evidence into context so that justice can finally be served. A $100,000 reward is being offered in exchange for information leading to the arrest of any suspects. Shanton Harris. Members of the public were shocked when a popular 19-year veteran of the Miami police force was accused of running a drug protection racket in 2018. 52-year-old Shanton Harris was best known for her community-oriented approach to policing, but her impeccable reputation took a hard hit when she and fellow officers James Archibald and Kelvin Harris were hit with cocaine conspiracy, trafficking, and weapons charges. The trio fell under federal scrutiny and became the focus of a 6-month sting. During that time, Shanton and her co-conspirators allegedly accepted payments totaling tens of thousands of dollars in exchange for protecting drug cartel members who were moving large amounts of cash. In one instance, she reportedly threatened a man with a gun and told a federal informant, who she thought was a drug dealer, that she would be willing to knock off a fellow police officer if they proved untrustworthy. The FBI also accused Shanton of selling a Miami police uniform to an undercover agent, with the full awareness that it would supposedly be used by a cartel hitman. Authorities arrested Shanton and the 2 fellow cops they believe she recruited into her criminal double life. In addition to leaving the community dumbfounded, her colleagues were in disbelief to see the well-liked officer accused of such serious crimes. Shandon had plenty of small blemishes on her behavioral record, but nobody imagined she would ever be capable of running an organized illegal operation. She pleaded guilty to conspiring to possess cocaine and was sentenced to 15.5 years in prison. Kelvin Harris received a 27.5-year sentence for his role in the conspiracy, and James Archibald was sentenced to 10 years. 11. Michael Lee Jones. 21-year-old Inna Budniecka was found battered and clinging to life in the Everglades in 2005. Someone had brutally attacked her and left her for dead. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but thankfully she pulled through and survived her injuries. When she regained consciousness more than 20 hours after being found, Budniecka had no recollection of how she ended up where she was found or who was responsible for what happened to her. She was initially so traumatized that she couldn't speak out loud. Limited to pen, paper, and somewhat limited English language skills, the young Ukrainian woman wrote down her lawyer's contact information for investigators. In the time leading up to the assault, Budniecka was staying at a hotel in Miami. She'd been injured on the job while working for a cruise line and was recovering while pursuing a lawsuit against her employer. There were initially no promising leads to help detectives narrow down Budniecka's attacker, and her memory was only returning in bits and pieces. She was also struggling to distinguish which memories were real, and as a result, the case went cold. Private investigator Ken Brannan took a crack at the case and noticed something that nobody else had. Surveillance footage from the hotel Budniecka was staying at showed her entering an elevator. She was never seen leaving, but Brennan did notice a man rolling a large suitcase in and out of the hotel during the period when she was last seen on security video and when she was found the next day. At one point, Budniecka could be seen engaging in small talk with the stranger. Brennan wondered if the man had stuffed Budniecka into the suitcase, and his fellow detectives initially thought he was crazy for thinking it was possible. But he ran with it, and he identified the man in the footage as Michael Lee Jones from Frederick, Maryland. Jones denied any knowledge or involvement in the crime and willingly gave a DNA sample. To the surprise of the investigators who doubted Brennan, it was a match. Due to limited evidence, Jones pleaded guilty to a lesser charge than what truly reflected his actions, and he served just 2 years in prison. But Brennan was convinced that Jones was a serial offender and campaigned successfully to get his DNA added to the National Combined DNA Index system. It paid off majorly when Jones's DNA matched with samples from several cold cases throughout the United States, including 2 assaults against women in New Orleans that happened in 2003, as well as another incident from Colorado in 2005. Jones was sentenced to 24 years to life in Colorado and received a 45-year sentence in Louisiana, which essentially means he'll remain behind bars for life, where he can no longer harm innocent members of society. 10. The unsolved murder of Omar La Parra. In one of Miami's most gruesome and baffling cold cases to date, a 21-year-old Guatemalan immigrant named Omar La Parra was murdered and dismembered back in 2009. A cyclist discovered garbage bags filled with his body parts floating around in Biscayne Bay. On the last night La Parra was seen alive, his friends tried persuading him to go home from a club in the city's Little Havana neighborhood because he was drunk. He stayed at the club though until it closed, according to witnesses. Cell phone activity from the next day led police to a local petty criminal who admitted to rifling through La Parra's pockets and stealing his phone when he was passed out drunk about a block away from the club. Detectives quickly ruled the cell phone thief out as a suspect. For now, the crime remains a true whodunit with no apparent viable leads. In 2012, investigators entertained the theory that La Parra may have been murdered by a notorious Canadian cannibal killer named Luca Rocco Magnotta. Certain aspects of how La Parra was dismembered resemble the techniques Magnotta used to cut up his dead lover, John Lynn. Magnotta put out the image of an international playboy on his social media profiles, leading some to think he may have been in Miami at the time of La Parra's death. However, many suspect that he exaggerated his lifestyle and that there was no real reason to believe he was actually in the city. A Miami Police Department spokesperson told the press that if they found any evidence that Magnotta was in the area at the time of LaPara's death, they would consider him a possible culprit in the case. But the idea appears to have gone nowhere, and the identity of LaPara's killer continues to elude authorities to this day. 9. Stevenson Charles. On at least 3 separate occasions in October and November 2022, men in the Miami area met up with someone they met on the Grindr dating app expecting to have a good time, only to be held at gunpoint and violently robbed and assaulted. In the first incident, the victim was forced to drive to an ATM and withdraw cash. The suspect, later identified as 21-year-old Stevenson Charles, allegedly dropped the victim off on the side of the road and drove away in his car. During the second encounter gone wrong, Charles was accused of ambushing a different victim at gunpoint, going through his phone and threatening to kill him after finding photos of him with another man. According to the victim, Charles then drove to several stores and bought things with the man's credit cards. The third incident began when the suspect and victim met up in Dania Beach. Charles allegedly forced yet another man he met on Grindr, along with the victim's roommates, to withdraw $1,500 from ATMs. He stole the roommates' phones and dropped them back off at home, then drove off with the victim to a secluded area, where authorities say he made several homophobic statements and shot the man multiple times. Luckily, the victim survived despite being struck in the head. Charles pleaded guilty to 17 federal counts relating to the crime spree. He's due to be sentenced in April 2023 and could face life in prison, along with a hate crime enhancement. 8. Tommy Reyes. As the openly gay president of Miami's Fraternal Order of Police Union, Sergeant Tommy Reyes is one of the city's most influential cops. So, when he was suspended in 2022 for reasons that the police department didn't immediately explain, the public and press were eager to find out the whole story. According to a police report obtained by the Miami New Times, Reyes pulled a gun on a man he met through a dating app in Tallahassee, located in the state's panhandle. Police were called to the scene based on reports of a robbery, and while Reyes accused his date of stealing his wallet, it was the sergeant himself who was arrested in connection with the incident. He was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and the ordeal sparked an internal investigation in the Miami Police Department. Reyes told the Miami New Times that he wouldn't comment beyond saying that he was a victim and had nothing to hide, and that the Tallahassee police victimized him again. According to an incident report, Reyes met with his date at a hotel room and things went poorly. The date ran off with the sergeant's wallet and allegedly threatened to blackmail Reyes after finding his ID and badge. According to the date, Reyes agreed to let him go on a shopping spree with one of his credit cards if he returned the wallet. Reyes denied giving the man permission to shop with his card, which was used to pay for more than $1,300 of merchandise at Best Buy. The men met up later that day so Reyes could get his wallet back, at which point an altercation broke out and Reyes pulled his gun. Responding officers concluded that the date was trying to blackmail the high-ranking cop, but that there were grounds to charge Reyes. In the end, though, the prosecutor declined to pursue the case, and Reyes was cleared of any wrongdoing. 7. Makian Mercer and Janaea Nagash. 2 young women from North Carolina lost all composure at Miami International Airport one morning in 2023 when they were told they couldn't board their Frontier Airlines flight because they were 45 minutes late. What started out as a verbal argument quickly devolved as one of the women, later identified as 20-year-old Makian Mercer, threw a plastic sign holder at an airline employee, leaving her with a cut on her face. As police officers struggled to take Mercer into custody, her friend, 21-year-old Janaea Nagash, allegedly tried to get in the way, yelling, "Don't touch her." Nagash was charged with resisting arrest, with violence and disorderly conduct. Mercer was handed the same charges, with an additional charge of aggravated battery. On top of having to shell out cash for another flight, they each posted a $500 bond in order to regain their freedom while their cases played out in court. Have you ever met someone from a dating app and got really bad vibes from them that you couldn't ignore. 6. Miami-Dade Jane Doe. Residents at the Biscayne Gardens apartment complex in the Miami-Dade County awoke one morning in 1979 to find a dead young woman lying at the edge of a wooded area next to a dumpster in the building's parking lot. Someone had strangled her, and she hadn't been dead for very long, according to the medical examiner. Based on where she was found, detectives theorized that she was killed elsewhere and then dumped in the parking lot. They determined that she was likely between the ages of 17 and 25 when she died. She was Caucasian, with reddish hair and grey or green eyes, and she was slim and of average height. The Miami-Dade Jane Doe, as she was called, was wearing a white t-shirt, a floral scarf, and jeans when she died. Her legs contained marks consistent with having ridden a motorcycle recently, and she had some filings in her teeth, indicating that she had access to dental care at some point in her life. More than 40 years after being found dead, Jane Doe's identity continues to elude investigators. They've ruled at least 19 women out in their attempts to identify her. Early reports speculate that she may have been a 19-year-old woman from Hollywood, Florida, who went by the name Philoan S. Love, but no record of a person by that name's been located. Another theory suggests that she was a runaway from Ohio named Tina, who went by the nickname Sheba. But again, nothing's been confirmed, so whoever the Miami-Dade Jane Doe is remains a mystery. 5. Who killed Irving Al Sikora? Beverly Sikora walked in on a horror scene one day in 2001 when she entered her father's apartment in Miami-Dade County. She hadn't heard from 76-year-old Irving Al Sikora in 2 days and had become worried about his well-being, and with good reason, as she soon learned. Al had been bludgeoned to death inside his home. His skull was bashed in, and there was blood all over the apartment. The killer left behind fingerprints and footprints and was seen on surveillance footage buying beer at a local supermarket with Al. Despite the plethora of evidence, the culprit's identity eluded investigators. In 2017, they managed to extract a DNA profile from a tiny sample found among the evidence. The results indicate that the suspect has a brother who's in prison in Michigan. Knowing the brother's identity could lead police to the killers, but authorities in Michigan refuse to disclose who the brother is and will only reveal someone's identity in cases of a perfect match. With the suspect's DNA absent from criminal databases, detectives have once again repeatedly hit a dead end in the case. To further complicate matters, Al was known to frequently bring men home from gay bars and beaches. Several visitors were ruled out as suspects, but it wasn't unusual for strangers to pass through, which only makes the possibilities more endless. Until or unless law enforcement gains access to information about partial DNA matches in Michigan, the case may never be solved. Accessing the information won't guarantee answers, but it would be a promising step. For now, all law enforcement can really do is work any new leads that come in and hope that someone with information comes forward and helps crack the case. 4. Yesenia Sanchez. In November 2022, off-duty Miami police officer Damian Colon was shot in the head during an early morning confrontation outside his home in Hialeah, Florida, just outside downtown Miami. He collapsed on his porch and was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery and narrowly survived his injuries. A criminal complaint identified Colon's estranged girlfriend and former school cop Yesenia Sanchez as the suspected shooter. According to the document, Sanchez sped off from the scene in a truck and crashed into some parked cars at a high rate of speed. She then allegedly fled on foot, dropping her wallet onto the ground and leaving it behind in her rush to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Police found Sanchez at her home nearby and took her into custody on suspicion of attempted murder. According to a report, she and Colon were in a relationship for 7 years. Authorities claim that Sanchez was stalking the officer with a phone app. She reportedly waived her Miranda rights and confessed to the shooting. Sanchez resigned from her law enforcement career in 2021 following a domestic incident involving someone described as her police officer boyfriend in a report. She was accused of attacking the victim and deflating his car tires. For now, she remains behind bars without bail, and she awaits the next step in the court process. 3. The unsolved murder of Paula Sladewski. Aspiring model Paula Sladewski and her boyfriend Kevin Klim traveled from Michigan to Miami to ring in the 2010 New Year at a Lady Gaga concert. They spent the next several days clubbing. During the early morning hours of January 3rd, Klim was kicked out of a club for his behavior during an argument with Sladewski. He took a cab back to the couple's hotel room while Sladewski stayed at the club, but she was also kicked out shortly after Klim's departure. Sladewski was last seen leaving the club on grainy surveillance footage at 7:20 a.m. Some reports claim that an unidentified man followed her out of the venue, while others believe she left with the man. The video represents the last known sighting of Sladewski alive. Later that day, her body was found in a burning dumpster in an industrial section of North Miami. Her remains were so charred that she could only be identified through dental records. Investigators speculated that the woman's killer had specific knowledge of the dumpster, which wasn't in a location that members of the public would commonly know about. Klim was initially a person of interest, but was eventually ruled out. He accused the club's bouncers of having something to do with the young woman's murder, theorizing that the employees had kicked him out in a deliberate effort to split the couple up. The club's manager denied these claims and said that Sladewski left with an unknown man who didn't work there. Unfortunately, her murder remains unsolved to this day. 2. Real estate scammers. When 86-year-old Shirley Gibson went to pay her property taxes in 2021, she learned that someone had already paid the bill. The cashier showed the confused elderly woman a deed showing that the historic property in Coconut Grove had been sold to a real estate company in Brooklyn. Someone had signed her name without her knowledge or permission. Soon after that, a neighbor told Gibson that someone posing as her dead father had listed another one of her properties for sale online. The senior citizen told the Miami New Times that she never planned to sell her properties, which have been in her family for more than a century since her grandfather moved to Miami from the Bahamas in 1904. Gibson hired a lawyer who had the listings taken off the internet and looked into the case. The good news was that the property still legally belongs to Gibson since it was sold fraudulently. Gary Bonzin, who heads the company that closed on the deal, told the New Times that a lot more property closings have been done remotely since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Sadly, Gibson's case reflects just one among 50 similar complaints that the Miami-Dade police had recently received around the same time that the story broke. Following an investigation, authorities charged Chantel Vanessa Chang, Jason Webley Sr., and Otis Lathan Powell with 6 felony counts, including grand theft, money laundering, and theft from a person 65 years or older. According to prosecutors, the suspects squandered the majority of the $230,000 they gained from the fraudulent sale by the time they were caught. 1. Devon Russell Jr. In October 2021, a 26-year-old transgender woman named Royal Poetical Stars was found shot to death in her Hummer in Miami Gardens. In an appeal to the public seeking information about the suspect, the Miami Gardens Police Department mistakenly referred to Stars by her dead name, the male name she was assigned at birth. According to LGBTQ+ advocates and the victim's family, this prevented them from learning about Royal's death in a timely fashion. A spokesperson for the advocacy group Equality Florida told the Miami New Times that it took about 2 weeks for them to find out about the murder, and that they learned about it only after a media outlet pointed out the error. The victim's friend, Sandy Fox, told the news outlet that the misgendering and use of Royal's dead name was an insult. Acting on various leads and tips, authorities identified 28-year-old Devon Russell Jr. as the suspected shooter in the case. He was subsequently charged with Royal Poetical Stars' murder, but at the moment the case appears to be ongoing. Would you rather have a murder happen a few hotel rooms down from yours during a vacation with your friends, or find out that someone's gone missing from a hotel you're staying at alone during a solo trip? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.